Okay, we are here on Mistral, as you know, 36.2, and we're going to start talking about the engine. First thing we have to do is access the engine compartment, and for that we're going to slide these two set screws up that hold it in place and take this out and just set it aside. I'm going to take off the back access point as well, just because it'll give us a little better visibility. And also there's a couple of locks, and that takes the back of the engine compartment off. There's also a side door for checking the oil, and we'll look at that in a minute. But first of all, this is a Yanmar Model 3 GM30 diesel engine, so 3 cylinders. And the first thing we're going to do is check the strainer. And on this boat, it's very convenient, sitting right here. And normally you can just look in and see that there's nothing, but I'll go ahead and take this off. And you can see that there's just a little bit of crud in there. So I'll dump that in the sink and put that back, but no seaweed. And then you just snug this up so that the O-ring is seated. I'm going to reach down and get the through hole open, and also at the same time take the key off so the through hole is open. Okay, so this, while it's basically the same engine as on Wojo, there are a couple significant differences, one of which is the raw water pump, which is sitting down almost below the engine, and we're going to have to go in through the side compartment to get a better look at that. It's definitely not as convenient if you had to change the impeller. Okay, so you can see the brass water pump. If you had to change that impeller, you would have to reach in there with either a mini socket or a screwdriver to take that back plate off. Definitely not as convenient as some of the other boats. While we're here, we're looking at the side of the engine, and here is the dipstick. So you would, again, want to pull this out, clean it off, and get an accurate reading of the oil. We also have the fuel pump. This should be a mechanical fuel pump. Okay, my finger is now on the mechanical lever. If you ever had to prime this, you just pump this up and down. On Wojo, it's got a bit of red paint. On this one, it's got a little bit of rust. So you can tell where that lever is. That's to prime. If you ever changed the filter or had a leak, needed to get air out of the line, that is the manual fuel pump. As long as we're here, fuel, so we've switched from talking about water to fuel as long as we're sitting here looking at it. But fuel comes into that pump, goes into a final filter, which then goes up to the high pressure pump. Okay. We are now going to talk again about the cooling system. We see that raw water pump. That comes to a heat exchanger, and this is really very different from all the other boats. We looked at the water pump, which is down here. This hose that comes out across the front of the engine is the raw water, which is now going into the heat exchanger. This heat exchanger is more integral with the engine than on the other boats where it's more of a separate entity. So this is raw water going in. We'll look in a minute at raw water coming out, which then gets dumped into the exhaust. But the engine cooling is the antifreeze or freshwater system is seen here. This is the reservoir, and this goes into the engine, comes out here, also goes off to the water heater, which we'll find in the lazarette later. These are the lines for the water heater. We also have a valve that you can shut that off, as well as the temperature gauge. So we will go to the back of the engine and take a look at that again. The lines have changed color, but this is the raw water coming out and then getting injected into the exhaust here, which then you see the exhaust line, and that's heading to the aqua lift, which we will find right here. This aqua lift looks similar to the one on Zephyr, although a little larger. And so this is, again, a very important component, because if you crank the engine without the engine starting, water is still being pumped, but the exhaust is not pushing it out. And this can literally then back up into the exhaust manifold. And the path to that is actually quite short here. So this is actually more critical, that if you go more than 30 seconds without the engine starting, that you drain the aqua lift. And how do you drain it? Well, right at the back is a drain. And you can see it in there, but right down there is the drain, and that just drains the water into the bilge. So it's very important, specifically on this engine. This is, we're looking at the coolant, the freshwater antifreeze 50/50 with water reservoir, which is at the back of the engine compartment. It's very easy to access from the back, as you can see. A little harder to read and get from the front of the engine. Let's talk about fuel system. We've already looked at a little bit of that, but fuel line comes in into a array core, where we can look at the fuel in the bottom and see that it's nice and pink. There's no other residue in there, any water, which would come out looking milky. That could be drained, but that has to be done carefully. That then goes to the mechanical pump that we looked at earlier, and to the high pressure pump and into the injectors. While we're looking at the top of the engine from back here, we can actually see the fuel lines, which are the metal lines, because it's high pressure, going into the injectors. Again, since this is a Yanmar, there are no glow plugs. It requires the compression. But here you can see where those injectors are. They're getting fed by these metal lines that come over from the high pressure pump. Oil can be added right here. That's an access point. And another nice feature of this engine, which we don't find on many of the newer ones, is you have a compression release. You actually have that right here, where you can release the compression, and if you had a weak battery, you could spin up the engine and then close that, and it would have a better chance of starting. So there's 3 of those, 1 for each cylinder, so it's a little tricky, but you can set those and then release them in sequence. So definitely a nice feature. if you're stuck with a weak battery. So now we should talk about the electrical system and the batteries, because on this boat it is also very different. On this boat we don't have a Perco like the Catalinas. We have 3 switches under the step. One for the engine on the starboard side of the boat, one for the house. These are in the off position right now, and one for the ground, which is really odd, but we always leave that in the on position. So we are actually going to turn both of these on, and they snap into position. And so we have the power for the engine and the house both turned on. Also, the windlass switch is right here. You can turn that on, and even though the light doesn't come on, it should be on. This has been broken numerous times, so we haven't replaced it. People tend to kick it. So that is the switch for the windlass. But let's talk about the battery system. So we're now looking at the batteries, and we have 2 compartments. We have 2 house batteries, which are here on the starboard side, and an engine battery. So kind of an odd feature of this is that the charger, which is a Xantrex, and you can see one of its sensors right here, just charges the house battery, and when the engine's running, at least this is the way it was when we got the boat, that charges the engine battery, the alternator. But to charge everything all the time, we've added basically a coupler or a crossover, a ACR, and that is seen here. But we also have 2 other switches, and we'll explain that in just a moment. You will find this diagram on the website for Mistral, the boat information page, and it's definitely something you should become familiar with if you're cruising the boat. It shows how everything is connected together, and that you have the ACR, which we just talked about, which cross-links the batteries, either when it's under you're charging with the engine alternator, or with the Xantrex when you're at the dock. But there's also separate switches. For example, if the ACR fails, you have a bypass switch, so you could then couple them. The advantage of the ACR is if you are running down the house batteries and they drop below a certain level, the ACR will drop out so that you don't drain the engine battery. So that's a safety feature. So this is pretty complicated. It's helpful to have a electrical engineering degree, but there's a nice diagram that has a table, and there's actually a separate write-up, and you can thank Harry Kane for this. So you've got a description and all the different conditions, and so it tells you what position things should be on, especially these battery combiners, in case you have, well, for when you're secured at the dock, normal operation, when you have an ACR fault, when you wish to isolate the dead engine battery, and also normal operation with the engine battery isolated. So you have all these different conditions. And if we go back over to those switches, you'll see they are labeled. The emergency bypass, which bypasses that ACR, is said to be leave off unless it's needed. And the other one is the isolation, where you would disconnect the engine battery, and that's normally on. But if you had a fault in the engine battery, you'd want to turn that off. So complicated, but if you follow the diagrams and the table, it tells you what you need to do. So fortunately, we haven't had too much trouble, but batteries do die, so it's good to know this, especially if you're cruising. Okay, one other thing is that ACR has an indicator light, and that is not in that compartment, but here on the panel. And so when this green light is on, it says ACR combined. That means you know everything's working properly. If that light were to be off, it means one of the batteries has probably gone south. And you would need to troubleshoot that and find out why you don't have a combined, or possibly the ACR itself is faulted. But our experience is those are pretty reliable. Could be a bad wiring, maybe a connector's got loose, maybe the battery needs water, has dropped below the threshold for the ACR. But if you see that, then it's best to troubleshoot it. You can also look at the voltage. Right now we're up above 14 because we have the charger on, and you can look at both the house and the engine batteries separately, and it tells you that at least right now they're charging as we're sitting in the slip with shore power on. So somewhat more complicated than the Catalinas, but it's a good system, and so far it's not caused any problems. So let's consider an example. Say you're out at anchor at Smugglers, and Sunday morning you get up and go to turn on the engine, and all you hear is silence when you push the starter button. You come back down below, make sure your switches are all set under the companionway, for example, the engine switch, and then you start doing a little troubleshooting, and you notice that the ACR has dropped out. The light is not on. That happens when one of the batteries on either the house or the engine goes below a threshold. You then look at the voltages on the meter and see that your engine battery is down below 11 volts, which means you've had a battery failure. Probably a cell or two has shorted out. So now you need to isolate that battery, and to do that you actually turn off the engine isolation switch, which is normally on. And what we're looking at here in our table of switch positions is the bottom scenario. You want to get a normal operation, meaning start the engine, and you have to isolate that engine battery because it has failed. Now, because the ACR has dropped out, you have to turn on the bypass switch, and that allows the house to be connected to the starter engine. And hopefully your house batteries are still happy, so you'll be able to start the engine and proceed home, even with a failed engine battery. So this is complicated, but this is a great system that Harry Kane put together, and it solves a host of problems. Anyway, that's an example you may run into on Mistral. Okay, in the galley, we have a cold plate in the ice box. Okay, and the compressor for that cold plate is actually quite close, just under the stove. And I believe that is still completely functional. The switch to turn that on will be on the main panel under refrigerator. We're going to talk about the water system. One nice feature this has is you can look at the water tanks. Okay, I've just turned on the water pressure pump, and now we can press the button for tank 1, and we see it's basically at least half full. There's 3 levels, and if there's only a red light showing, it means it's empty. Tank 2 says it's full. So I believe tank 1 is in the bow, tank 2 is in the stern. So it's nice, convenient, tells you what your water levels are. And to select those tanks, you come over here and you can look at the gauges, and right now it has tank 1 on, which is the one that wasn't full, and tank 2, which is in the stern, closed. And so that's why it's still full. It hasn't been drawn on. Now, also in this compartment, if we take this cushion off, we find a number of items. One is the water pressure pump, which is right here. And so that will pressurize the water from the tank you selected. There's also a strainer, which is a nice feature, and it's nice and clean right now. But also down here, you have the impeller for the knot meter. And then just outboard of that is the depth sensor. There's also a small container, which I believe is a kind of a pressure reservoir for the water system. Okay, we're now going to look at Mistral's bilge. And you can see it's quite shallow. If any water builds up in here and the boat's heeling at all, it can get quite messy. We can see the bilge pump, which is in red, and then this is one of the sensors that when water gets up, it will turn it on and actually leave it on for a little bit after the water level drops. So not a float switch, but a water sensor. And we've seen that on several of the other boats. Angel Sea has it, as well as I believe Sorella. So those work well, and especially in this shallow bilge. Okay, we are in the head for Mistral, and most all of the controls are under the sink. We can see we have the drain for the sink, which you would just open like this. We have the macerator, which I'm not going to open, but here's the macerator. Here's the through hole for the macerator. You have a Y valve, which is, and a through hole for direct discharge, but this is set in the holding tank position, which is required by the Coast Guard. Okay, we have off to forward part of this a shower drain. This is the through hole for that, which you would open, and there's actually a pump here, so that will pump out the shower sump. And so if we step back, one of the features for the shower is there's actually a door here which has a bungee holding it, but you can close this and you have a self-contained shower with a sump down below. And the way to operate that is with this switch. And I can hear it, the motor going. So that would drain as long as you have that through hole open. Now just below that is the button for the macerator. So as where most of the other boats have the macerator switch on the main panel, this one has it as a button. So you would want to be 3 miles offshore or 6 miles off the islands and open the through hole and then push that button, and it should drain the holding tank. It's almost hidden. It's tucked down here. It almost looks like it's for the shower sump, but that's actually the water intake for the head. So to operate the head, you'd want to open that and use the head, and then at least when you get back to shore after you're done with the head, you close that salt water intake for the head. We are looking at the port aft lazarette, and there's a number of features. First of all, there is the shore power breaker coming in, and that is on right now. But if you didn't have shore power, you should, after you plugged everything in, you can check to see if this breaker had tripped. Also, while we're sitting here, you'll see a valve. This is for the shower on the swim step, so that would turn on the shower. Here we have dual propane tanks. Nice feature. You can always have a spare, and pretty decent size, so should never run out of propane. And all you have to do is make sure you looked at Bill Matson's description of don't trust the pressure, weigh the tanks. Okay, so directly below us we have this wooden box. That's actually the holding tank. When we bought this boat, it had a holding tank that was minuscule, and so we actually replaced it with a decent sized one. And then just in front of that you will see the Xantrex. That is the actual battery charger, and you can probably hear it humming away because it's on. And so there's a couple breakers on that, but I've never actually seen those pop. Little push button type breakers. One important thing that I didn't mention earlier was that if the batteries get low, like below 11 volts, the Xantrex will actually drop out because it runs off of the batteries, the controller. So in those instances, it won't turn on until you've actually charged the batteries with a separate charger. Okay, so again, we're in the aft port lazarette, and the water heater is down here, and it's going to be very difficult to get to. I think you have to actually access it from the back of the aft compartment. But if you were to have a coolant leak, that might be one source for that. Remember that we did see a valve on that coolant line so that if you did have a leak, you could shut that line down, which is actually a nice feature that they don't have on the Catalinas. This is the starboard aft lazarette. We have some antifreeze, some oil, some treatment, fuel treatment, a fire extinguisher, and the stern anchor. So there's actually a lot of excess storage room in this compartment.